Morning, everyone. So we are on chapter 10 of Florence Nightingale, the Angel in the Crimea. And finally, after all of that preamble, the opening bit of the book, we've got to Florence Nightingale working in the hospital, and it describes what she found. So, Miss Nightingale arrived at Scutari on November the 4th. You've seen what she found, but there was worse to come. Only 24 hours after her arrival, the wounded from the Battle of Inkerman began to come in. Soon, every inch of the room in both the barrack and the general hospitals were full. Men by their hundreds were lying on the muddy ground outside, unable to find a room. Even on the floor of the corridors, neither the Lady-in-Chief, that's Florence Nightingale, nor the nurses had had time to rest after their long journey, to make plans for the systematic work to be done, even to take a breath after their first glimpse of the horrors around them, when this great avalanche of suffering and misery came down upon them. No woman in history has had to face such a task as now flung itself upon Florence Nightingale. She met it as the great meat trial quietly and calmly. Her cheeks might have been pale at what she had to see, but there was no flinching, no trembling. Ship after ship discharged its ghastly freight of soldiers at the ferry below. Train after train of wounded men was dragged up the hill, brought into the overflowing hospital, laid down on the pallets of mattresses, on bare floors, on the muddy ground, wherever a space could be found. Indeed, someone wrote, the men lay in double rows down the long corridors, forming several miles of suffering. As the poor men were brought in, they looked up and saw the slender woman in a black dress with a pale and beautiful face, which was topped by a close-fitting white cap. Quietly, but with an authority that no one ever thought of arguing, she gave orders directing where the sufferers were to be taken, which doctor was to be called, what nurses were to attend them. During these days, she was known sometimes to stand on her feet for 24 hours, so all day at a time, seeing that each man was put in the right place where he might receive the right kind of help. Can you imagine that? 24 hours, the whole day. Where a particularly severe operation was to be performed, Miss Nightingale was present wherever it was possible to give both the surgeon performing the operation and the patient comfort and support of her wonderful calm strength and sympathy. In this dreadful influx at the Inkerman wounded, the surgeons had first of all to separate the most hopeful cases from those that seemed that couldn't survive. The working force was so insufficient that they must devote their energies to saving those that could be saved. And once Miss Nightingale saw 5 men lying together in a corner, she just left them as if they had come, just as they had come from the vessel. Can nothing be done for them? She asked one of the surgeons. He shook his head. Then will you give them to me? Take them, replied the surgeon, if you like, but we think their case is hopeless. Now, can you remember the dog, right back at the start of the story, that wounded dog? All night long, Florence Nightingale sat beside those 5 men, one of the faithful nurses with her, feeding them with a spoon at short intervals till their consciousness returned, and a little strength began to creep back into their poor, torn bodies, then washing their wounds, making sure they were tidy and decent, and all the time cheering them up with kind and hopeful words. When the morning came, the surgeons were amazed and pronounced the men in good enough condition to be operated on, and we hope, though the story does not tell us, we don't find out about it, we don't know whether they were saved or not. Is it any wonder that one of the poor lads burst into tears and cried that he couldn't help it when they saw them, and he thinks of only the English women coming out here to nurse. It seems so homelike and so comfortable. In those days, one of the nurses wrote home to England, it does not appear absolutely impossible to meet the wants of those who are dying of exhaustion. Out of the 4 wards that I work with, 11 men have died in my night simply because they are tired, which, humanly speaking, might have been stopped could I have had enough time to lay my hands on them and on some food, as I know they ought to have had. It is necessary to be as near the scene of war as we are, to know the horrors which we have seen and heard. I know not which sight is most heart-rending, to witness such fine strong men and youths worn down by exhaustion and sinking under it, or others coming in so fearfully wounded. The whole of yesterday was spent, first in sewing the men's mattresses together, and then in washing them, assisting the surgeons when we could, in dressing ghastly wounds, and seeing poor men made as easier for their circumstances would admit of, and after their 5 days of confinement on board a ship, during which space their wounds were not dressed, we have not seen a drop of milk, and the bread is extremely sour. The butter is most filthy. It is Irish butter in a state of decomposition, so that means it's gone off, and the meat is more likely moist leather than food. Potatoes we are still waiting for until they arrive from France. This was written 6 days after the arrival of Florence Nightingale. By the 10th day a miracle had been accomplished. Miss Nightingale had established and fitted a kitchen in the hospital, from which 800 men were fed daily. They were given beef tea, chicken broth, jelly, a quiet wave of a wand, and these things sprang up as if it were out of the earth. And you can hear how the men describe it. On arriving at the hospital in the morning, one man was given a bowl of gruel, which is a little bit like porridge. "Tommy, me boy," he said to himself, "that's all you'll get inside this blessed day, and think yourself lucky you've got that." But 2 hours later, if another of those blessed angels didn't come, entreating of me to just have a little bit of chicken broth, well, I took that, thinking maybe it was early dinner, and before I had well done wondering what would happen next, round the nurse came again with a bit of jelly, and all day long at intervals they kept on bringing me what they called a little nourishment. In the evening, Miss Nightingale, she came and had a look at me and says, "I hope you're feeling better." I could have said, "Ma'am, I feel as fit as a fighting hen," but I managed to get out something a bit more polite. How was this miracle accomplished? Up to this time, the method of giving out stores had been much more like the method of cooking and washing. There were no regular hours. If you asked for a thing in the morning, you might get it by the evening, when the barrack fires were out, and if you could get nothing at all until it had been inspected by an official, approved by that official, and finally given out by another. These were called service rules. They were really folds and coils of a monster called red tape at his work of binding and strangling. Red tape is just governments doing a machine that it's basically a machine where you have to ask for something and then ask somebody else for something and somebody else for something, and it takes ages for somebody to do something, where simply you could just get up and go to a cupboard and get it yourself. Simply enough, Miss Nightingale was with the foresight of a born leader, had anticipated all of this and was ready for it. The materials for all of the arrowroot, which is something that you put in a tea, beef tea, chicken broth, wine jelly of those first weeks, came out of her own stores. She'd brought them with her. She had no intention of waiting for a day or an hour. She had not a day or an hour to waste. So like I said, she just went and got it herself. Hang on a second, So, as I said, all good and comforting things came in those first few days out of Florence's bag. Or ship, she brought it with her. She hired a house close by the hospital, set up a laundry with every proper and sanitary arrangement, and there, every week, 500 shirts were washed, besides other garments. But now came a new difficulty. Many of the soldiers had no clothes at all, save the filthy and ragged ones on their back. What was to become of them while their shirts were being washed and mended? The ship's bag gave another hop, at least I think it would have been, for pure joy at the good of it was doing, and out came 10,000 shirts. And for the first time since they left the battlefield, the sick and the wounded men weren't just full and fed, they were also clean and comfortable. But the Lady-in-Chief knew that her fairy stories were not of the kind that renew themselves, and having once got matters into something like decent order and comfort in the hospital, she turned quietly and resolutely to do battle with the monster known as red tape. The officials of Scutari did not know what to make of the new state of things, and as I have said, many of them had shaken their heads and pulled very long faces when they heard that a woman was coming out who was to have full power and authority over all things to do with the care and sick of the wounded. They honestly thought, no doubt, that the confusion would be doubled. What could a woman know about such matters? What experience had she of rules? What would become of them all? They were soon to find out that Florence Nightingale did not cry or wring her hands or do any of the things they expected. She simply said that this or that must be done, and then saw that it was done. Her tact and judgment were as great as her power and wisdom. Suppose she wanted certain stores that were in a warehouse. The warehouse was locked, so she sent for somebody to unlock it. Would he please open the warehouse and give her the stores? He was very sorry, but he could not do this. She went to the chief officer. He was very sorry, but he would necessarily have a meeting of the entire board. Well, who makes up the board? Well, so-and-so and so-and-so, and Doctor this and Doctor that, and Colonel this, that, and the other. Well, where were they? Well, one of them was not here, and this person was probably busy. Well, could you please go and get them, so I can speak to them? And this was what Miss Nightingale had to deal with. And so, of course, she would get them all together, and she would meet them, get the order signed, go away, say thank you and good morning, go back to the warehouse, it would be opened, and the goods would be on their way to the hospital, before the man who said he couldn't open the hospital had really had time to have his breakfast. And the people in charge of the red tape would just say, hang on a minute, she doesn't give us time to think, time to breathe. The moment a thing is wanted, she goes and gets it done. This wasn't what we were used to. But she was very careful to do it in a proper and orderly fashion and make sure she wasn't upsetting people, and she did it the right way and said, but I'm doing this because the men are dying, these are our soldiers, and that she didn't want to get people into trouble, and she would say, you won't have any blame for this. I will take the responsibility upon myself. And she made sure that the men wouldn't be in trouble. The door was opened, and in a few moments, sick men had the stimulants to get better. And when Miss Nightingale arrived at Scutari, the death rate at the Barrack Hospital was 60%. Within a few months, it was reduced to 1%. So, to put that into numbers for you, that would mean that if 100 soldiers went in when Miss Nightingale arrived, 60 of them died. Within a few months, if 100 soldiers went in, only one of them died. That's how successful her plan was. And now you know why she was called the Angel of the Crimea. So a poem was written about her, and it goes like this. Whenever a noble deed is wrought, whenever is spoken a noble thought, our hearts in glad surprise to higher levels rise. The tidal wave of deeper souls into our innermost being rolls, and lifts us unawares out of all meaner cares. Honour to those whose words or deeds thus help us in our daily needs, and by their overflow raise us from what is low. Thus thought I, as by night I read, out of the great army of the dead. Thus thought I, as by night I read, of the great army of the dead, the trenches cold and damp, the starved and frozen camp, the wounded from the battle plain and dreary hospitals of pain, the cheerless corridors, the cold and stony floors. Lo, in that house of misery, a lady with a lamp I see, pass through the glimmering gloom and flit from room to room. And slow as in a dream of bliss, the speechless sufferer turns to kiss her shadow as it falls upon the darkening walls, as if a door in heaven should be opened and then closed suddenly. The vision came and went, the light shone and was spent on England's annals through the long hereafter of her speech and song. That light its rays shall cast from portals of the past. A lady with a lamp shall stand in the great history of the land, a noble type of good, heroic womanhood. Nor shall be wanting here the palm, the lily, and the spear, the symbols that of yore Saint Philomena bore. And this starts chapter 11, The Lady of the Lamp. Miss Nightingale's headquarters were in the Sisters' Towers, as it came to be called, one of the four corners towards the great building. Hers was a large, airy room with doors opening off each side. The middle was a large table covered with stores of every kind, constantly in demand, constantly replaced, and on the floor and flowing into all of the corners were more stores: shirts, socks, slippers, dressing gowns, sheets, flannels, everything you can think of that was useful and comfortable in a time of sickness. About these piles the white-capped nurses came and went like bees about a hive. All were quietly busy, cheerful, methodical. In a small room opening off the large one, the Lady-in-Chief, Miss Nightingale, held her talks with nurses, doctors, generals, or orderlies, giving all the same courteous attention, the same clear, calm advice or directions. Here, too, for hours at a time, she sat at the desk writing letters to Sidney Herbert, who sent her out there, letters to Lord Raglan, the Commander-in-Chief of the Army, who, though at first didn't want her to come out there, became one of her firmest friends and admirers. Letters to the wives and mothers and sisters in England. She received letters by the thousand. She could not answer them all with her own hand, but I'm sure she answered as many as she possibly could. One letter was forwarded to her by the Herberts, which gave her a great pleasure, not to her only, but to everyone in all that place of suffering. It was dated from Windsor Castle. Who lives there? December the 6th, 1854. Would you tell Mrs. Herbert, wrote good Queen Victoria, that I beg she would let me see frequently the accounts she receives from Miss Nightingale or Miss Bracebridge, as I hear no details of the wounded, though I see from so many from officers about the battlefield, and naturally the former must interest me more than anyone. Beg Mrs. Herbert to communicate my words to those ladies, as I know that our sympathy is much valued by these noble fellows. Yours, Victoria. That's from the Queen. I think the tears may have come into those clear eyes of Miss Nightingale when she read those words. She gave the letter to one of the chaplains, and he went from ward to ward, reading it aloud to the men, and ending each word with "God save the Queen." The words were murmured or whispered after him by the lips of sick and dying, and through all the mournful place went a great wave of tender love and loyalty towards the good Queen in England, and toward their own Queen, their angel, who had shared her pleasure with them. You could hardly believe that in England, while the Queen was writing this, some people were still sadly troubled about Miss Nightingale's views, and were writing to the papers warning other people against her. But it was happening. So after this time, and with the public finding out that Queen Victoria had written to the soldiers, they raised some money, and a man from the Times newspaper, Mr. MacDonald, was asked to go out to the hospital to see what was going on out there, and with the money, and having bought some equipment and clothing, to see Florence and see what was going on, to see Florence Nightingale. So Mr. MacDonald went out to the Barrack Hospital and asked for the Lady-in-Chief. I should like to have seen Florence Nightingale's face when she heard his story. No help needed. The soldiers supplied with everything they needed. Everything? Okay. Come with me, she said. She took him through the wards of the Barrack Hospital and showed him what had been done, and what an immense deal was yet to do. How many were comfortably clad, yet fresh hundreds were arriving constantly half naked, without a shred of clean or decent clothing on their backs. How far the demand was beyond the supply, how fast her own stores were dwindling, and how many of the private offerings were unsuitable for the needs they were sent to fill. How many men were still, after all her labours, lying on the floor because there were not beds enough to go around. And all these things good Mr. MacDonald saw and laid heart, but he saw other things beside. In the Barrack Hospital, there were 2,000 or 3,000 patients. It was a city of pain. Its streets were long, narrow rooms of corridors, bare and gloomy, no furniture save the endless rows of cots and mattresses, packed like sardines. Its citizens were men in every stage of sickness and suffering. Following the slight figure of his guide through these narrow streets of the city of pain, MacDonald saw and noted that wherever there is disease in its most dangerous form, and the hand of the spoiler distressingly nigh, there is the incomparable woman sure to be seen. Her benignant presence is an influence for good comfort, even among the struggles of expiring nature. She is a ministering angel, without any exaggeration in these hospitals, and as the slender form glides quietly along each corridor, every poor fellow's face softens with gratitude at her sight. When all the medical officers have retired for the night and silence and darkness have settled down upon those miles of sick, she may be observed alone, Florence Nightingale, with lamp in her hand, making her solitary rounds. The popular instinct was not mistaken which, when she set out from England, hailed her as a heroine. I trust she may not earn her title to a higher though sadder point. No one who has observed her fragile figure and delicate health can avoid misgivings lest they should fail. I confidently assert that, but for Miss Nightingale, the people of England would scarcely have been spared the additional pang of knowing, which they must have done sooner or later, that their soldiers, even in the hospitals, had found refuge and relief from the unparalleled miseries with which this war has been attended. For a moment, look with me into the eyes of these wards, through the miles of sick which the agent of the Times passed with his guide. It is night. Outside, the world is wide and wonderful with moon and stars. Beyond the dark blue waters of the Bosporus River, the lights of Stamboul flash and twinkle. Nearer at hand, the moonlight falls on the white city of the dead, and it shows its dark trees standing like silent guardians beside the marble tombs. Nearer yet, it falls full on the bare square of building that crowns the hill. The windows are narrow, but still the moonbeams struggle in and cast a dim light across the corridor. See where the moonbeam glimmers white on that cot under the window. There is where a Highland soldier is lying, he who came so nearly to losing his arm the other day. But Florence Nightingale begged for a little time to see if it could, just with care and nursing, that the arm might be saved. Would they kindly delay the operation for at least a few days? The surgeons consented, but for time no one could or refuse her anything, and the arm was saved. Now the bones are knitting nicely, and by the soldier will be well and strong again, with both arms to work and play nicely. But broken bones hurt even when they are knitting nicely, and the Highland lad cannot sleep. He lies tossing about on his narrow bed, gritting his teeth now and then as the pain bites, but he is still a happy and thankful man. He stares about through the gloom, trying to see who is awake. But now he starts, for silently the door opens, and a tiny ray of light, like a golden finger, falls across his bed. A figure enters and closes the door softly, the figure of a woman, tall and slender, dressed in black with white cap and apron. In her hand she carries a small shaded lamp. At sight of her, the sick lad's eyes grow bright. He raises his sound arm and straightens the blanket, then waits in eager patience. Slowly, the lady with the lamp draws near, stopping beside each cot, listening to the breathing and noting the colour of the sleepers, whispering a word of cheer and encouragement to those who are awake. Now she stands beside his bed, and her radiant smile is brighter. He thinks than lamplight or moonlight, a few words in a low musical voice, a pat to the bedclothes, a friendly nod, and she passes on to the next cot. As she goes, her shadow, hardly more noiseless than her footstep, falls across the sick man's pillow. He turns and kisses it, and then falls happily asleep. So she comes and passes like a light, and so her very shadow is blessed, and shall blessed so long as memory endures. And that is Florence Nightingale. I'll see you later. Bye.